The year was 1849, and the air in Boston, Massachusetts smelled reliably of coal smoke, sea salt, and the faint, sweet scent of desperation. Young Arthur P. Whiffen, a man whose ambition vastly outweighed his common sense, was polishing the boots of a particularly pompous banker when the news hit him like a rogue wave. "Gold, young man! Untold riches in California!" boomed the banker, flexing his substantial calf muscles. "A man could make his fortune overnight simply by scooping it out of the streams. I shall be investing in a fleet of clippers immediately." Arthur, then barely 20, and possessing the kind of dreamy naivety that only a career of polishing other people's dreams can instill, looked at the meager stack of nickels in his tin box. His daily routine involved inhaling boot polish fumes and dodging horse-drawn carriages. He spent his nights dreaming of a world where he was the one with shiny leather boots, not the one kneeling to make them so. The gold rush wasn't just a rumor. It was a dazzling, sun-kissed exit sign from the dreary reality of New England. "California," Arthur whispered, the word tasting of exotic spices and untold freedom. "I'm going to California." He spent the next 3 days liquidating his entire life's savings, all $47.14, on essential prospecting gear. This gear was a tragicomic collection that would have made any seasoned miner weep with laughter. It included a sturdy, brand-new shovel, purchased purely for its aesthetic appeal, a gold panning dish, which Arthur mistakenly believed was a frying pan, 3 pairs of thick woolen socks, excellent for Boston winters, catastrophic for Californian heat, a well-thumbed copy of Moby Dick for inspirational reading, and most importantly, a single, magnificent, albeit a slightly chipped top hat, because a gentleman, even a poor one, must maintain appearances. He booked passage on a dilapidated schooner named the Salty Siren, a vessel that looked suspiciously like a large, disgruntled wooden shoe. The journey around Cape Horn was less an epic voyage and more of a prolonged aquatic ordeal. Arthur spent most of the 3-month trip violently seasick, clinging to his top hat and contemplating the financial wisdom of returning to his stable career as a shoe-sign boy. When he finally stumbled ashore in the bustling, chaotic, and muddy port of San Francisco, Arthur P. Whiffen felt a surge of pure, unadulterated opportunity, followed immediately by a crushing sense of bewilderment. San Francisco was a symphony of roaring commerce and rampant lawlessness. Tents sprouted like bizarre mushrooms, saloons were louder than church bells, and everyone, absolutely everyone, looked like they knew precisely what they were doing. Arthur, in his pristine top hat and clean clothes, stood out like a newly minted penny in a barrel of rusty nails. His first order of business was to acquire transportation to the Motherlode, the legendary gold-bearing streams inland. He was looking for a sturdy, reliable mule. What he found was Barnaby. Barnaby was a donkey, not a mule, and a particularly cynical one at that. He was short, covered in matted gray fur, and possessed a pair of ears that drooped with philosophical resignation. The former owner, a wiry gentleman with a nervous tic, assured Arthur, "Barnaby is a beast of rare character, son. Got a spirit of his own. Never needs motivating, he don't." Arthur quickly discovered what rare character meant. Barnaby's spirit was mostly dedicated to remaining stationary. He would walk 20 feet, then stop abruptly to contemplate a loose pebble or a particularly interesting patch of dust. No amount of gentle coaxing, frantic pushing, or even the promise of a fine Boston shoe polish could convince Barnaby to accelerate past a leisurely snail's pace. Arthur spent a week trekking the 60 miles to the nearest promising dig site, often having to carry Barnaby's saddlebags and occasionally Barnaby himself, a feat of adrenaline-fueled desperation, on his back. When they finally arrived at the famed American River, Arthur was a wreck. His top hat was dented, His woolen socks were sweat-soaked and shredded, and his enthusiasm had been thoroughly seasoned with the dust of the trail. He found an unoccupied stretch of riverbank, proudly staked his claim with a hastily carved stick, and surveyed his domain. He unpacked his gear. The gold pan, still mistaken for a cooking utensil, was set down. The shovel, too long and heavy for effective work, was propped up. Arthur stood by the river, a man ready to pluck his fortune from the water. Only he hadn't actually seen anyone doing any plucking. A grizzly, bearded man named Grizzly Jim, whose face looked like a topographic map of unfortunate life choices, watched Arthur from 50 yards away, chewing on a piece of dried tobacco. Arthur decided to attempt his first pan. He scooped up a large, heavy load of gravel, mud, and water into his frying pan and began to shake it vigorously, exactly as he imagined a prospector would, or perhaps as he imagined a chef tossing a large salad. The mud flew everywhere, coating Arthur from head to toe in a gritty, brown paste. The water sloshed off the sides, taking 90% of the precious river sediment with it. After a minute of this chaotic performance, all that remained in the pan was one small, ordinary river stone. Grizzly Jim spat a brown stream onto the ground. "First time, son?" he bellowed, his voice sounding like rocks tumbling down a canyon. I stood up straight, wiping mud from my top hat. "Indeed, sir, but I assure you I am a quick study. I was just acclimating the silt to my methods." "Silt? Heh. Well, your methods just lost you about 3 ounces of potential dust, shoe sign boy. You're panning it wrong. You gotta swirl, not shake like you're arguing with a wasp." Arthur, mortified but determined, watched as Grizzly Jim demonstrated the smooth, rhythmic, almost sensual swirl of a proper gold pan. It was an art form. Arthur's second attempt was slightly less disastrous, but still yielded nothing but dirt and despair. His third attempt, he accidentally dropped the whole pan into the river. His fourth attempt, Barnaby, the philosophical donkey, strolled over and promptly stepped in the pan. Arthur P. Whiffen, the ambitious shoe sign boy who came west for untold riches, sat on the muddy bank of the American River. He was covered in mud, exhausted from fighting an inanimate donkey, and in possession of precisely 0 gold. He looked at the dented top hat, the useless shovel, and the uncooperative river. "Prospector 0, he muttered to himself, a mud-caked, self-assigned title. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that the hard part wasn't finding the gold. The hard part was merely surviving the next week. But as the sun dipped behind the Sierra Nevada, casting a golden glow on the dust and the chaos, Arthur smiled a small, tired, and determined smile. He might be Prospector 0, but he was here. And he wasn't going back to polishing boots just yet. He still had Moby Dick to read after all. The real challenge, he realized, was not the river, but the donkey. And tomorrow, the challenge would arrive in the form of a stolen map and a very large, aggressive bear.
Arthur P. Whiffen, now comfortably settled into his new role as Prospector 0, awoke the next morning to the rhythmic thump-thump of a nearby shovel. The sun was barely up, yet the riverbank was already a hive of industry, a stark contrast to Arthur's own method of operation, which mostly involved trying not to slip in the mud. He carefully dusted off his top hat, a hopeless endeavor, and went to check on Barnaby. The donkey was gone. In Barnaby's place was a single, crumpled piece of parchment pinned to the ground with a rusty tent peg. Arthur snatched it up, his heart immediately sinking to the bottom of his empty gold pan. It was a crudely drawn map, emblazoned with an alarming red X and a scrawled message. "Dear Top Hat, I've borrowed your beast. Barnaby has a fondness for licorice, and I've a fondness for moving heavy things without doing the moving myself. If you want your donkey back, meet me at Dead Man's Creek, just past the Widow Jenkins' claim, at sundown. Bring your shovel, and don't tell Grizzly Jim. Silent Sam. Arthur, ever the optimist, decided that Barnaby had simply been invited to a gentleman's gathering, and this Silent Sam was merely a polite coordinator. He grabbed his shovel, his copy of Moby Dick, one must always be prepared for a quiet moment of reflection, and set off in the direction of Dead Man's Creek. The track took him directly across the path of the Widow Jenkins' claim. Widow Jenkins was a woman built like an oak barrel and possessed a stare that could curdle milk. She was one of the few women mining the claim herself and was famously successful, a success many attributed to the fact that no man dared argue with her about property lines. As Arthur skirted her territory, he saw Grizzly Jim hurrying toward him, looking genuinely agitated. "Whiffin, where the blazes are you off to?" Jim demanded, spitting a jet of tobacco juice near Arthur's polished boot. "I'm meeting Mr. Silent Sam at Dead Man's Creek to retrieve Barnaby. He seems to be in need of a pack animal, and I—" Grizzly Jim grabbed Arthur's arm with a grip like a rusty vise. "Idiot! Silent Sam is a snake. He doesn't borrow beasts, he steals them, and then he uses the owner as a distraction. He's after the Widow Jenkins' mother-lode claim. She's got a huge seam of quartz right on her edge, and Sam's been trying to jump it for weeks." Arthur's mind reeled. "But the map! He asked me to bring my shovel. He's using Barnaby as a decoy?" "He's using you as a decoy, you mutton-headed dandy. By the time you get to Dead Man's Creek, he'll be used Barnaby to haul the stolen quartz, and your meeting will consist of him knocking you unconscious with your own shovel." The gravity of the deception hit Arthur hard. He had been played, not just for a fool, but for a distraction in a scheme involving high-stakes claim jumping. "We have to stop him," Arthur declared, turning immediately towards Widow Jenkins' claim. Grizzly Jim was already running. "Too late! He's probably there now, but we can catch him on the haul. Quick, which way did Barnaby go?" Arthur pointed vaguely towards the widow's claim. "Towards the large, shiny quartz formation." The two men, the grizzled veteran and the bewildered newcomer, raced towards Widow Jenkins' claim. They arrived just as the sun began to dip, painting the dusty canyon walls in shades of orange and blood red. And there, amidst the quartz outcropping, was the source of the chaos. Silent Sam, a lean man with shifty eyes and a nervous energy, was frantically trying to load chunks of magnificent gold-bearing quartz onto the back of a deeply unhappy Barnaby. The donkey, true to his rare character, was staging a silent yet highly effective protest. Every time Silent Sam secured a heavy sack of quartz, Barnaby would take exactly one step sideways, shake his whole body violently, and then collapse the sack. The donkey's philosophical resignation had transformed into passive-aggressive resistance. "Move, you flea-bitten mule!" Sam hissed, pulling sharply on the reins. Barnaby simply let out a long, wheezing sigh that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle, then folded his legs and sat down squarely on the largest sack of stolen quartz. "Halt, you fiend!" Arthur shouted, emerging from the shadows, his top hat still surprisingly on his head. Silent Sam froze. He looked at Arthur, then at Grizzly Jim, and then back at the donkey, who was now calmly chewing on the drawstring of the sack. "Well, well, if it isn't Top Hat," Sam sneered, pulling a large, intimidating pickaxe from the ground. "You're a mite early. Where's your shovel?" "I left it behind. I intend to subdue you with the sheer force of my moral rectitude," Arthur announced, an utterly useless but impressive declaration. Suddenly, a new voice boomed across the claim, one that shook the dust from the quartz. "What in the blazing blazes is going on here?" Widow Jenkins stood at the entrance to her claim, arms crossed, holding a double-barreled shotgun with the casual familiarity of a woman holding a cup of tea. Silent Sam immediately dropped the pickaxe. "Widow Jenkins, ma'am, it's all a misunderstanding. This donkey, he just wandered on to your disappearing claim, and these two gentlemen, they were just—" "Disappearing claim, you say?" the widow interrupted, her voice dangerously low. "My claim ain't disappearing, but you are." She didn't even have to raise the gun. The sheer force of her personality and the implied threat of heavy weaponry were enough. Silent Sam, realizing he was trapped between a furious woman, a cynical donkey, and two witnesses, made a split-second decision. He bolted. He dove into the thick brush by the river, vanishing in a frantic tangle of limbs and profanity. Grizzly Jim let out a booming laugh. "The goose chased the fox, but the goose caught the wind. Well done, Whiffing. You saved the widow's motherlode claim." The widow lowered the shotgun, a small, grim smile playing on her lips. She looked at Arthur, then at Barnaby, who was now completely asleep on the quart sack. "The donkey did most of the saving," she conceded, "but I appreciate the prompt appearance, Mr. Whiffin. It seems you and your beast have stumbled into a true misadventure." Arthur, breathing heavily, felt a rush of genuine excitement, the first he'd felt that hadn't been related to a fresh pair of leather boots. He hadn't found gold, but he had thwarted a crime and stared down a shotgun. That was almost as good. However, the adventure wasn't quite over. As Arthur retrieved Barnaby, who woke up only long enough to complain dramatically, the widow Jenkins noticed something odd about the corner of the claim where Arthur had first spotted the donkey. "Wait a minute," she said, walking over to where Silent Sam's pickaxe had been lying. "Where's that little claim marker I put here this morning? The one with the big red W?" Arthur and Grizzly Jim stared at the spot. The claim marker, which officially demarcated the rich corner of the widow's land, was gone. "Sam must have ripped it out on his way in, hoping to put his own marker down later," Grizzly Jim theorized. The widow Jenkins shook her head. "No, look closer. He was too busy fighting the donkey. It looks dug up and replaced." The three of them scoured the area. A few feet away, lying half buried and covered with fresh dirt, was a small, crudely carved stick, the very same one Arthur P. Whiffin, Prospector 0, had used to stake his worthless claim the day before. In his panicked flight, Silent Sam, needing a replacement marker to make the widow's claim disappear temporarily, had grabbed the nearest available stake, completely oblivious that he was moving the worthless claim of an amateur. The result? The widow Jenkins' rich corner of the motherlode was now legally and officially marked by the original useless claim marker of Arthur P. Whiffin. Arthur P. Whiffin had accidentally become the owner of the richest 3 square yards in the territory. He stood there, mud-caked and still wearing his ridiculous top hat, staring at the stick that had just made him a very, very wealthy man, in theory. "Well, bless my soul," breathed Grizzly Jim. "You've gone from Prospector 0 to the richest man on the river by pure accident." The widow gave Arthur a look of grudging respect. "You got luck, boy, the kind that money can't buy. Now I suggest you guard that stick with your life, because there are a lot of men around here who'll gladly trade a fortune for an inch of quartz." Arthur looked down at the pathetic stick, then at the massive, magnificent vein of quartz. He didn't feel rich. He felt terrified. His accidental fortune had just painted a massive, luminous target on his back. He had saved the claim, but now the claim owned him. Arthur P. Whiffin, the former shoeshine boy and newly minted owner of the richest claim on the American River, was having a terrible, no-good, very bad time being rich. The sun had barely risen, but the weight of his accidental fortune felt heavier than Barnaby's entire saddlebag. He sat guarding the pitiful stick that marked his claim, clutching his trusty copy of Moby Dick for moral support. The widow Jenkins, true to her word, had stationed herself on her adjacent property, occasionally firing a warning shot into the air at low-flying buzzards, which served the double purpose of keeping scavengers away from her claim and reminding Arthur that she was watching. The moment the news of the disappearing claim and the appearance of Top Hat Arthur as the new owner spread, the riverbank transformed. Arthur's claim became a magnet for every desperate, opportunistic, and genuinely menacing prospector in a 10-mile radius. "Just taking a look at the geology, friend," a burly miner with a beard like steel wool would grunt, inching closer to the stick. "Step back, sir. I assure you the geological structure is perfectly sound and heavily defended," Arthur would declare, trying to sound intimidating while simultaneously hiding his shaking hands behind Moby Dick. Grizzly Jim, meanwhile, had taken on the role of Arthur's unofficial and highly exasperated bodyguard. "Stop smiling at him, Whiffin. You look like a goose offering itself up for Christmas dinner. Growl. Look mean." Arthur tried to growl. It came out as a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. The real problem was the actual gold. Arthur, overwhelmed by the responsibility of guarding his claim, hadn't actually mined any of the incredibly rich quartz vein. He had the wealth in the ground, but none in his pocket. He was a gold billionaire who couldn't afford a decent meal. "You gotta blast it, boy," Grizzly Jim insisted. "Break that quartz open and get the ore out. Everyone here knows it's there, and the longer you leave it, the more tempting it is to the cutthroats." Blasting. The word filled Arthur with horror. He was a man who polished shoes. He did not engage in the controlled detonation of geological formations. However, the constant threats, the sleepless nights, and the sheer terror of having hundreds of desperate eyes fixed on his back finally spurred him to action. He spent the next 3 days learning the precarious art of boring holes, packing black powder, and laying a fuse, all while Barnaby, his loyal, cynical companion, stood nearby observing the proceedings with an air of profound disapproval. Finally, the day came for the big blast. Arthur set a charge on the largest, shiniest section of the quartz vein. He lit the fuse, which immediately began to fizzle with a frightening intensity. "Fire in the hole!" he screamed, his voice cracking. He and Grizzly Jim dove behind a large rock formation. Barnaby, with surprisingly nimble speed, simply trotted behind a tree and stuck his head out to watch the show. Kaboom! The explosion was magnificent, showering the air with rock fragments, dust, and a triumphant cloud of smoke. When the air cleared, Arthur rushed forward, heart pounding with anticipation. This was it, the moment he would transform raw rock into solid gold. The blast had indeed fractured the quartz vein, revealing the glistening interior of the vein. But instead of the deep yellow streaks of gold they expected, the cavity was dominated by a dazzling, almost iridescent hue. "What is that?" Grizzly Jim muttered, wiping dust from his eyes. "It's too shiny for pyrite, too blue for copper." The cavern was filled with a massive crystalline structure. It wasn't gold. It wasn't silver. It was a giant, shimmering, perfectly formed geode, split open by the blast, revealing thousands of deep amethyst crystals that glittered like purple fire in the sunlight. Arthur stood speechless. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but commercially, it was a disaster. Amethyst was a semi-precious stone, not the hard, circulating currency of the gold fields. A wave of laughter rippled through the gathered crowd of onlookers, followed by shouts of derision. "It's a fool's fortune! Purple rocks! Better off mining pebbles, Whiffin! A goose chase, all right! Looks like he mined his claim right down to nothing!" another roared. The crowd, realizing the enormous quartz vein was not a gold mine but an amethyst deposit, lost all interest. They were after portable, transactional wealth, not pretty rocks. The entire mass of dangerous, gold-hungry prospectors dispersed almost instantly, melting back to the river to resume their search for yellow dust. Arthur's target, the enormous, terrifying target on his back, had just vanished. "Well, I'll be," Grizzly Jim said, scratching his beard. "It's beautiful, but it ain't gold, boy. What you gonna do now? You got the most valuable pile of purple paperweights in California." Arthur, however, was no longer looking at the crystals with the eyes of a prospector. He was looking at them with the eyes of the former shoeshine boy who appreciated beauty and quality. He saw something rare, something unique, something that didn't invite bloodshed and greed. "I'm going to use it," Arthur declared, a confident smile finally replacing the terror on his face. "I came west for a change in fortune, not just gold, and I believe the East will pay handsomely for true rarity." He spent the next 2 weeks carefully extracting the massive, flawless amethyst geodes, with Barnaby's help, who, for some reason, seemed entirely content to haul heavy purple crystals instead of gold quartz. He packed them carefully in soft cloth and boarded a steamer headed back to the East Coast. The rest is history. Back in New York, Arthur P. Whiffen didn't open a bank. He opened the Californian Curio Company, specializing in rare geological treasures from the western frontier. He sold the amethyst to wealthy Eastern merchants and jewelers who had tired of common gold and were looking for exotic prestige. His purple rocks, precisely because they were rare and non-utilitarian, were worth a fortune. Arthur P. Whiffen, Prospector Zero, never found an ounce of gold, but he found something far more valuable, a niche, a skill outside of mining, and the realization that not all that glitters had to be gold to be a golden discovery. He found success by bringing beauty back to the dreary streets he had left behind. He retired a wealthy man, famous for his goose chase of '49. He had a magnificent home, 3 faithful servants, and a large velvet pillow for his one and only true friend, Barnaby the donkey, who spent his retirement peacefully napping in a large sun-drenched stable, still occasionally sighing like a cynical old philosopher, but now doing so in comfort. And on top of the mantelpiece in the grand drawing room, Arthur kept his most prized possession, the dented, mud-stained top hat, a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest treasures are found when you're looking for something entirely else.